Well, everyone, it's time for us to go and take a look at the original Google Pixel and see how this specific phone holds up in 2023. Now, this phone I think was actually super interesting. It was a new kind of direction that Google was trying to do back in 2016 when this phone came out, and I think this was a really smart thing for, Google to do. In fact, I think this was one of the first phones I used on this YouTube channel, to be honest, now that I kind of think back. But if you want to pick up some phones I would recommend this year, the links will be down in the description. You can get them from there and you can help support the channel at the same time. Now, I remember back in 2016 when this specific phone first came out, and honestly, it didn't look ugly. It definitely had a lot of bezel on it for that time. But when you looked at the competition, things like the iPhone 7 Plus, the iPhone 6s Plus, some Samsung Galaxy, I think the S7 was out at that time, a lot of people were basically making the distinction that at least, those phones had a home button or reason for them to have, those bigger bezels. There wasn't really a big reason for this Pixel to have these big bezels, but it really wasn't that big of a deal. Like, even when I purchased that phone in 2016, I honestly felt like it was fine. It reminded me a lot of my Nexus 4 that I used probably like 2 years before this one, or maybe even at this time I had my Nexus 4. And the good thing about having these like big massive bezels on a phone like this is that if you're playing games or if you're doing something in landscape, it gives you an area to kind of hold the phone at. So that was kind of an interesting thing. Now, on the front of this phone, we had a pretty decent 5-inch AMOLED display. It was 1080p and it was a really good panel for that time. When I looked at the competition, of course you had better panels like on the Samsung side, but this thing had an AMOLED display. The iPhone 6s Plus and 7 Plus at that time still only had IPS panels. So I kind of thought this was probably the better way to go during that time. And I still think it looks like a pretty decent panel for sure. Now again, pretty big top and bottom bezels, not really that big of a deal here. On the bottom we had a USB-C port, which was amazing. And we had a headphone jack on this phone too. Now you have to remember back then, a lot of, at least like Apple was going through and removing the headphone jack at that time. And I think Google made the claim that, that we still keep our headphone jacks and whatnot. And then literally the next phone after they removed it, which was very corny of them to do. But at least with this phone, it still had it, which was nice. And on the back, we had this aluminum back, which felt very premium. Then we had this glass portion at the very top of that panel, or the top of that back. And then we had the fingerprint sensor on the center back of that phone, which is a very interesting design. And this phone felt very premium in the hand. It felt like a pretty expensive phone, and even now, it still feels very premium. When I hold something like my Pixel 2 or my Pixel 3, even like my Pixel 4, I don't really feel like that phone is as premium feeling as this one. I've always felt like that, I don't know why, but this phone felt very premium. It still holds up very well in the body standpoint, and honestly, I will get to this a little bit later, but even in the software standpoint, it's really not that far. It's definitely outdated now, but it's very interesting how well this phone has held up throughout time. Now that kind of covers it up on the outside. Now in the camera department, this was that one area where a lot of people were looking at this phone and they hyped this phone up like crazy. They loved this phone so much because of the camera, and rightfully so. I think this was a really good approach for Google to position themselves, because with their Nexus lineup before this one, they had not the best cameras. I think the Nexus 6P started having that great of a camera, but then what happened, that phone ended up having boot looping issues and hardware issues and people stopped buying it. With this one, this was a clean slate. And even though I missed the Nexus lineup, this camera was really good for the time. It was a 12.3 megapixel, standard lens. It was 4K at 30. You can film on the back. 8 megapixel front-facing camera with 1080p on the front. And a really good thing about this type of camera setup was that it was right before the huge craze of multiple cameras. So, Google was very slow to adopt that, which was kind of their stagnation for a few years with the Pixel lineup. But this camera really focused on software, and it really focused on the actual, camera UI, and also the software improvements Google could add. And I remember a lot of camera competitions during that time. A lot of people said that the Google Pixel, the original one, was better, and I would probably agree with that. I wasn't really doing camera comparisons at that time, but even now, if I go and compare this camera to an iPhone 7 Plus during that time, or even an iPhone 6s Plus, it's definitely, I would say, on par, if not better than the 6s Plus. But the thing I do kind of like about the 7 Plus and the iPhones and phones that came out right after this one are the multiple cameras. I love having multiple cameras on the back. This one only had one. But honestly, if you look at the Pixel 3, that also only had a single camera. So it was years until, Google were to implement it. So I think the camera setup on this thing is really good for its time. And I would say it's aged pretty decently for sure. Now, one of the biggest things with the Google Pixel and with any Google phone in general are these software updates. When you're getting a phone like the Google Pixel 1, or at least a Google Pixel in general right now that's still supported, you're going to be getting software support for many, many years. And that is a very cool area to be in. When you're getting a phone like the original Pixel, it's not supported anymore, but there are custom ROMs available for this thing that you can download and install. But another crazy thing with this phone was actually the fact that it got, a couple versions of Android. I mean, it actually lasted for quite a bit of time. It started off with Android 7.1. It did go up to Android 10. And like I said, there's been a lot of custom ROMs that you can install on this device. And Google makes it really easy for you to install those types of custom ROMs. So that's why I look at a phone like the original Pixel, and I'm actually really happy with the way it lasted. Although it didn't last as long as maybe the newer Pixels are going to last in terms of number of years, I still think Google did a great job, and there's not a lot to kind of hate on this specific phone in that standpoint. So I look at the original Pixel, and I'm like, wow, Google did a pretty good job during that time. And even in the performance side, Google did a pretty decent job, as well. So in 2016, one of the better chipsets during that time was that Qualcomm Snapdragon 821 chipset during that moment, and this phone had 4 gigabytes of RAM inside. Now, as of this point, of course, that is a very, very outdated chipset. Actually, it's not even that outdated, to be honest, but it's definitely outdated, for a majority of things you're going to do. But you have to look at the landscape. The Galaxy S7 only had 4 gigs of RAM. It probably had the same chipset. The iPhone 7 Plus that came out during this time had 3 gigs of RAM. The 6S Plus had 2. So this phone was pretty much on par with, it was probably a little bit better than in some of the performance sides than even some corresponding Androids, mostly because of that stock Android. It wasn't super bogged down, didn't have a lot of processes going around. And again, I remember during that time, anything I threw at this phone at that time in 2016 was perfectly fine. And even now in 2023, it still is a very good performing phone for the basic necessities that you would do. I don't want to give the impression that this phone is, just going to be able to handle Genshin Impact at the highest levels or like, some crazy emulation or something like that. It's going to be very basic. If you can do it on like an iPhone 7, then you can do it on this type of device. So just kind of keep that in mind. But I do look at something like the Google Pixel, and I'm honestly pretty happy with the performance. I do think the way Google's approached their current phones with their Tensor chipset, I feel like the problem with those is that they're not using Snapdragon, they're using Mali GPUs, and that can cause some issues with a lot of applications not being optimized for those Mali GPUs. But I think regardless, something like the Pixel 1 is perfectly fine, but I wouldn't recommend buying it if you're trying to get the best performance from this type of device. Now, battery life, this was kind of, I think, a mixed bag, 2,770 mAh battery. Since then, our battery sizes have gotten so much bigger. But as I've stated before, it's kind of outdated. The battery's probably degraded over time. And I think there may have been some battery issues that this phone came out with early on, but then they got fixed, a little bit after. So to kind of sum up this video, what I'll tell you is, I definitely do think the Google Pixel was a very good phone when it first came out. It's kind of iconic in a way. And although it didn't get like the best, future output for the last like 2 versions of this phone, in terms of the Pixel 2 was pretty decent, I would say, but the Pixel 3 was kind of weird. The Pixel 4 was kind of weird. And then the Pixel 5 kind of fixed it a little bit. I'm glad Google was kind of able to recover their image, but I still think the, original Pixel set the bar pretty good. Like it set the bar pretty high. So, I was really happy with the way they approached it. If you want to buy this thing, go for it, but I probably wouldn't recommend buying this thing anymore. At the very bare minimum, I would recommend buy like a Pixel 4a or a Pixel 4, but a Pixel 5 is probably the better way to go. So that pretty much covers it up. If you have any other thoughts or questions, let me know in the comment section below. Hit the like button, that would mean so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. More importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.